And it's time for the Pacific Rim Report with David Santoro from the Honolulu-based Pacific Forum. Now, David co-wrote an article in the publication National Interest that asks a question so big I would have never thought to ask it. What do we do about China? And I might start by saying, why do we have to do anything about China?
Well, I think we can't do anything. We have to do something. Let me put it this way. We cannot not respond. And some people will say we need to actually go to war against China. I think that doesn't make sense. So we know that we're competing, that we need to compete against China. What does that mean? What's the end goal? Where are we going? And very recently you had a very powerful article that said we need to win the competition. We need to actually defeat China. I think this is dangerous. I don't think that this is where we need to go. I think we need to stay ahead of China. We need to maintain a comfortable lead over China. And frankly, this is hard enough. So I resist the calls for, or the dreams of defeating China and ultimately calling for a form of regime change.
Yeah.
We know how bad this is. We know the results of those policies in other cases. I don't think this is what we want to do with China.
Yeah, there are a couple of places in the article that do compare with what we did to or about Russia that didn't really work in the long run. And it's funny, you mentioned war. If you haven't read this article, the two extremes that he starts with are going to war and doing nothing. And so he's looking at things in the middle that might work better than either of those two options. There are some areas where China and America's work together or have symbiotic relationships that actually work okay, mostly in the area of manufacturing, I guess.
There is some work. Frankly, I think this is narrowing just because the relationship is so bad. I don't want to close the door to potential cooperation with China. People talk about climate change as an area where we could do some work together. I don't think we need to close the door to this. Frankly, I'm skeptical that we can do anything. I'm also skeptical about people calling for potentially sharing power with China. I don't think Xi Jinping is interested. Mm-hmm. And so that's why we need to compete. We need to stay ahead. Yes, let's leave the door open to potential cooperation. But unfortunately, I don't think that we're in a good place to give any serious hopes to that.
Interestingly, China has its own questions it needs to answer for itself, not just about how it deals with America, but what it deals about the fact that other nations in the region are starting to take some of the jobs China had.
Right. Well, absolutely. Not only that, but they're also worried about other nations in its neighborhood actually sort of calling out what China is doing. We've seen recent events with the Philippines as well. So they are starting to pay attention. Of course, they blame the United States for trying to encourage that. But this is something that increasingly they will need to pay attention to.
It's interesting that all of this really is something that we should have our best brains thinking about all the time, because there is so much potential harm that could be done if we get it wrong. And that goes for China as well as for us.
Well, absolutely. And frankly, I would argue that we're not sufficiently focused on that problem set. We talk about it, it's in policy documents, but we are not devoting the attention and the resources that we need to.
Okay, you can think about this now. It's 7:16, and we'll have more sunrise for you coming up in just a moment.